what turn did your life take at 21?
Noel Moran was convicted of murder and served a life sentence.
Now he goes back into prisons to provide wellness and health classes.
We ended up going round to see a friend of ours. This guy, he was a friend of mine, a friend of his, and when we got there, he attacked the lad and he stabbed him in the leg, and as a result of that, he passed away.
So you're convicted of murder despite the fact you say you didn't inflict any of the injuries to the victim who died. What was your sentence?
So I got life with a minimum tariff of 15 years, and my co-defendant got 17 years.
So 2 more years.
2 years more for actually committing it.
So at no point did he accept responsibility?
No.
Welcome to the Second Chance podcast. I'm your host, Raphael Rowe. On this podcast, we talk to people from diverse backgrounds who share their stories of redemption, resilience, and second chance. Go to our YouTube channel so you can watch those interviews, subscribe, share, and click on the notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
So Noel, thanks for joining me on the Second Chance podcast. I know we've communicated in various different ways, but we've not really had the chance to meet. So even though we're meeting virtually, it's still nice to see your face. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, and thanks for having me here. And yeah, it's good to be able to kind of just share my journey and kind of what I've been through and what I'm going through.
Well, that's good. What's your plans today? What is the day in the life of Noel today? So before we even go back to what your journey was like once upon a time, what have you got on your agenda apart from speaking to me today?
Well, my day consists of pretty much back-to-back meetings, but they're virtual meetings, so at least I don't have to leave home to be able to do it. So it's nice when you can cut out the travel sometimes, but again, it's nice to see people face to face as well, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and we've got so used to this whole kind of virtual kind of meetings. It's just quicker, easier. But I had a conference with some of my foundation members recently, and it was so nice to be in a room with people and sort of bounce ideas around and brainstorm, where you can interact in a completely different way. And even when you're doing things virtually and you have 5 or 6 people on a call, it's kind of, you have to wait for somebody to finish talking before you talk. You can't interrupt in the same way that you can in real life. So I think, there's something to be said to being able to be in a room, and I suppose most people are.
Yeah.
Let me start, Noel.
You can stick them in a breakout. You can stick them in a breakout room.
It never really works, does it? Because the virtual kind of rooms never actually activate. I've been pushed into breakout rooms, 1 person turns up, 5 people moan about not being able to get into the room, so it kind of breaks down before it even starts. Let me let's find out a little bit about who Noel is. So just give me a kind of potted history of where you grew up, Noel, and what life was like for you as a young man growing up in wherever it is you grew up.
Yeah, so I've grown up pretty much back and forward between England and Ireland, and it was probably more so tougher growing up in the kind of 80s and the 90s, being Irish and growing up in London, where the kind of height of the troubles and things were kicking off. So just putting up with a lot of prejudice for being Irish, really from a very young age, found it quite difficult. But I managed to overcome that and didn't let it really kind of impact me in my own personal growth and developing myself.
What do you mean that it was a troubling time for you? Because, most people who are here in the UK will be aware, but also outside will be aware of the troubles, meaning, the conflict between the IRA and the British establishment, etc. But what do you mean? How did it affect you and your life?
I think it was probably kind of prejudice within schools and kind of just a lot of racism within schools and just people having their kind of opinion. It's kind of like, most recently when the kind of 9/11 things started to kind of kick off and people just had their negative perceptions towards Muslims and, people from the Islamic background. It was kind of like the same back then, where if you were Irish, then you were put within the same category. which obviously people just didn't really have an understanding of actually who was who and what was what.
And it was just driven by your accent, because you had an Irish accent. They classed you as being somebody who was a threat.
Yeah. Even though I was this small little, tiny little kid, definitely wasn't a threat.
And what was it like for you? So, that in itself is shocking that you were treated that way, but, people from all different ethnic backgrounds have been treated that way and continue to be treated that way. And they're obviously tarnished with the same brush of individuals who do things that hit the headlines, and then everybody is kind of, categorized in the same way. How did that affect your schooling then and life in London when you were here?
It definitely got me into probably a lot of trouble within schools, just in terms of my engagement and not really wanting to be there. And I got brought up doing boxing from a very young age. I started boxing at the age of 4. So I was, fortunately for me, and maybe unfortunately for me at times, that I was able to take care of myself. So even though this did go on within school, it did go on within the playground, but I certainly wasn't one to stand by and let it happen. So I tended to stick up for myself.
What were the consequences of you sticking up for yourself?
Getting expelled from school at a very young age. So I got expelled at the beginning of year 8, which then didn't really kind of help me in terms of an education. And then I couldn't get to any other school within the borough. I ended up going to a PRUS, a special school for expelled students, where I only had to go 2 days a week, which kind of suited me fine in a sense, but it was quite cheeky really, because I probably haven't told my dad this, so if he listens to this podcast, he's going to hear it. So he used to drop me off at school, and I used to have a car parked out the back of the school. So even from an age of 13, 14, I used to walk through the front of the school, walk out the back of the playground, into my car, drive off for the day, and then I'd come back at the end of the day, park it at the back of the school, walk back in through the front, and he'd come and pick me up. So he'd think that I'd been in school all day.
And you were able to pull the wool over his eyes for so long, and if he hears this, he's going to know for the first time what you were up to. Oh my God! What was? I mean, you talk about the sort of disruption that you went through during your schooling, and you just talked about how you walked through the front gate and out the back gate, and then through the back gate back into the front gate, pretending that everything was good. But what was your parents' reaction to your behaviour, getting expelled from school for fighting? How did they try and manage your behaviour when you were behaving in this way?
I've always had a really good upbringing for kind of from both of my parents, and it was the same for them as well. Like my mom would get called names often, walking down the street. My dad would get called names, and probably my dad, kind of like myself, he would stick up for himself. So it's, from a parent side of things, when you see your father maybe sticking up for himself, then as a child you probably think it's okay as well.
So they kind of understood why you reacted the way that they reacted, whereas the authorities or the schoolmasters didn't quite get the issues, or if they did, they weren't doing anything to try and help.
I think, well, the only thing they did to help was just didn't really feel that you fitted in, or didn't really feel accepted within the class. But when you're in a school like a PRUS anyway, they call you the naughty kids. So you automatically you have that label on yourself that you're a naughty kid. And actually, I wasn't really a naughty kid. I probably just rebelled against authority and rebelled against the system because I didn't want to be there.
And the car that you had at the back of the school, was that something you owned, or was it a stolen car?
No, it was something I owned.
You owned a car, you owned your own car at 13, 14 years old?
Yeah.
Did you ever get pulled up in the car by the police or anybody else?
Luckily, at the time, I did get pulled up a lot throughout kind of growing up and as I got older, but at the time when I was actually in the school, I didn't. Luckily enough, and I don't know how, because I was a really small young teenager as well. So if I was a police officer, I was definitely pulling me over.
Where did it lead to then? So you were quite disruptive at school because of the racism and the bullying and the challenges that you faced being a young Irish man. in England, where people were perceiving people from Ireland to be, troubled people. Where did it lead to? Did you end up getting in trouble with the law?
Um, not initially. So I started going to a youth centre, which I really enjoyed. They were doing car mechanics there, and so we got the opportunity to work on cars because cars was something that I really enjoyed doing. And we built this big, massive beach buggy from scratch. The only thing that we didn't build was the engine, so we got a Granada 3 litre Granada engine and stuck it in it and built the chassis, built the frame, built everything around it. So that was pretty fun. It's the wheelie when it used to take off. So that I would spend my days going 2 days in school, and then I would do 3 days doing the mechanical work. But then I just got to a point that I just didn't want to be in school anymore, and I probably left school completely by 14 and didn't end up going back.
How did your parents react to that?
Um, I think just at the time it was probably different times back then. I think if it was now, then there'd probably be more. There's more of a reaction on having more of a thorough education. But it wasn't necessarily encouraged for me to try get into any kind of education or any kind of schooling or anything like that.
So it weren't the academic side of things that you were interested in, it was the practical side, building cars and working in cars. And did that lead to a full-time job as a mechanic?
It didn't. It got to when I kind of reached the age of kind of 15, 16. I started working for a window company and doing double glazing. But then I had an accident. I fell off a ladder, fitting a window one day. Window come out and smashed me on the head and broke my collarbone. I woke up some hours later in the hospital. It was quite funny because I woke up and I just had my mates standing around me, and doctor's like, "Do you know where you are?" And I'm like, "Hospital." And then the pain just kind of massively hit me to my shoulder. But I've always been wanting to do my own thing, not really wanting to work for anybody else. So at the age of 16, I started kind of planning how I can start to build my own business and how I can work for myself. And by the time I come 17, I opened up my own security company. I got the idea from my uncle at the time. He had one of the biggest security companies in Ireland, and I was watching his business and I was watching how well he was doing. I thought, okay, if he can do that, I can do that over here. But it didn't quite work out for me at the beginning because I'm this young 17-year-old director going into big companies, telling them I'm the director of this security company. They're looking at me thinking you're a kid. So I went away and I thought, okay, I've got to change my approach a little bit here now. I've got to maybe come in from a different angle. So I changed my role within the company to the manager. So then when I come in as the manager of the company, I soon started landing contracts because I think, okay, well, he's not the owner. So, he's coming in as a representative.
And how did that lead to contracts with these companies? And what sort of security were you providing?
So I specialize in quite a lot of different security. So it was more so construction sites, 24-hour security, close protection, CCTV, K9 units and stuff like that. But from a business point of view, it was always the static 24-hour security that I was more interested in because you're always at work. You've got a guard on your site, or you've got two guards, one in the day, one at night. Then you're getting paid 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it's a constant inflow.
And was that something that created some financial security for you, or was it a challenge getting the contracts to keep the company going?
Definitely a challenge because you have multiple other companies that try to undercut, and it's really competitive business to really be involved with. And I was doing pretty well with it really up until the age of 21. I had in line some really big contracts. Who one of the companies I had, they've done the pipe work for the Channel Tunnel, and they were looking to be doing stuff within Heathrow Airport. And had I carried on going with that company, I would have potentially landed massive multi-million-pound contracts with them as well. But unfortunately, my life took another turn.
And what turn did your life take then? So you're 21 years old. You were on the you were on the verge of securing some major contracts, which would have been financially beneficial to you and the people that you worked with and employed. What turn did your life take at 21?
So at this point, I was doing pretty well for myself. I was engaged to be married. I was planning on moving back to Ireland probably say 6 months later, and I was out for a drink with a friend one night, and he got a phone call from people in the area who he had problems with, and we ended up going round to see a friend of ours. This guy, he was a friend of mine, a friend of his, and when we got there, he attacked the lad and he stabbed him in the leg. And as a result of that, he passed away. It hit the femoral artery and he died. And we both got arrested for it, and we got caught up. I got caught up on a joint enterprise. So even though I wasn't the one who actually committed the crime or didn't have any involvement within it, from a legal point of view, is from a joint enterprise is if you're there when a serious crime takes place, then you're equally responsible, as the prosecution put it.
So you and a mate went to another friend's house, just to be clear. So the friend that you went to the house with, he stabbed the person in the leg who subsequently died as a result.
Yeah.
Did you know he was carrying a knife with him at the time, or did he pick up a knife in the house?
He had a knife within the back of the car, and it was his car that we was in, and we just got pulled over. I was driving, literally 5 minutes before it happened, and I always think about this in terms of just reflecting on it, because had I known that there was a weapon in the car, well, number one, I wouldn't have been driving, but I probably wouldn't have stopped either, because normally any time I got pulled over, the police would search the car. But on this instance, they didn't search the car, but he was quite anxious. He really wanted to get out of there, and he really wanted to get away from the situation. And at the time, I didn't really understand why, but on reflecting about it afterwards, actually, I knew why he wanted to get out of there, because he had a weapon in the back of the car, and he knew that normally they would search the vehicle. But just unfortunately, they didn't.
So you and your friend arrived at this other person's house. He got out of the car, he took the knife with him to the house, and the fight broke out, and he stabbed the other guy. But you had no involvement in that fight or that stabbing.
No, I wasn't even in the house when it happened. I heard screaming and shouting coming from the house at the time, and I ran in there, and I could hear the screaming coming from upstairs. So I ran upstairs. And when I'm looking at the victim, bless him, he's on the bed, and the other guy is on top of him screaming and shouting at him. And then I'm shouting to, let's get out of here, let's get away. At this point, I didn't realise that he'd been stabbed. He had a duvet over him. So when we got back in the car, there was a massive argument going on between us, because as far as I was concerned, he was a friend, and he was a friend of both of us. So it was just really understanding really kind of what really went on, what was going on in his mind. But this particular guy, he was a bully. He wasn't a very pleasant person anywhere. And I think he went too far. He not sticking up for him in any way, shape or form. But he didn't intend to kill him. He stabbed him in the leg, but unfortunately as a result of that, it hit the femoral artery. Had it probably been a centimetre in any other direction, he probably would have survived.
How did you get arrested for that?
So after this offence happened, we panicked. We found out, that he had passed away, and I went back to Ireland. Well, we both went back to Ireland, and it was about 5 weeks later, he got arrested. I ditched him at this point. I thought I can't be around him any further. And then I arranged with the police for me to come back over and hand myself in, because as far as I was concerned, it wasn't something that I thought that I was ever going to be found guilty for. I didn't even know that the law of joint enterprise existed. In my mindset, I know that I had no intentions to harm anybody, or certainly not to kill anybody, and I didn't lift a finger. So I never thought that I would be ever convicted. So I handed myself in, and then found myself on remand, walking onto the wing of Wormwood Scrubs for the very first time.
After the incident took place and you learnt that the victim had died, why didn't you go to the police then to sort of set out your position? Because, as you say, you weren't in the house when the incident took place. When you did go into the house, you tried to stop what happened. In fact, you did, from what you said, stop what happened, got your friend out of the house. And then once you discovered that the person had passed away, what stopped you going to the police and saying, look, this is what happened and this was my role, I was in no way involved?
I think at the time it was probably just a serious lack of consequential thinking skills and just a panic as well. Maybe had we not probably just panicked and gone straight to Ireland, it would have been a lot easier to, had I still been in the country, then I probably would have just maybe done that a lot sooner. But I didn't want to hand myself in Ireland either, because it wouldn't be as easy. I would have to go through an extradition process and all of that kind of stuff. So I'd rather just bring myself back and hand myself in. In hindsight now, with how mature I've matured over the years, because I say men mature in their 30s. So hopefully I've got to that point. I would have certainly, I wouldn't have been there in the first place, so I would have found a way to get myself away from that situation. And I would have went straight to the police and just explained my situation, explained my circumstances. But I think it was just age, immaturity, naivety, and just not having the right kind of social and thinking skills really to be able to solve the situation.
But you did in the end hand yourself in, at least after your co-defendant, if I can describe him as that, was arrested. You handed yourself into the police. What were you charged with, and what was your co-defendant charged with?
So we were both charged with murder. And so it's quite funny, the law of joint enterprise. It's because the police, like when you're charged, there's no such thing as a charge of joint enterprise. Even though it's a 300-year law, and the Supreme Court have ruled that the prosecution have been abusing their powers within this particular law, more so within the last 30 years. But that was the charge. So it was really, I couldn't really comprehend at the time why I had been charged with murder, and I certainly never thought that I was going to be convicted. But it's quite funny, even though we were charged under a joint enterprise, we had separate trials. We were tried together initially, and then 3 weeks into the trial, the prosecution stopped the trial and said some new evidence has come to light on one of the co-defendants, and it wouldn't be in the Crown's interest to trial both defendants together, and stopped both trials and then had separate retrials. So he got tried first, he got found guilty for the murder, and then I got tried separate and got found guilty under a joint enterprise.
And when you were tried separately and convicted under the joint enterprise, you were convicted of murder, despite the fact that you didn't inflict any injury to the victim.
No, and it's always been said that he was the aggressor and that he was the one who inflicted the fatal blow.
So why and how did you get convicted? I mean, I understand joint enterprise, and I understand you know what happens in those circumstances. Isn't it sometimes that the prosecution in joint enterprise cases, at least in some circumstances, where they can't identify the person who committed the actual act, that they say one of the two did? Was your co-defendant pleading not guilty to the offence and not accepting his responsibility? And did that create a conflict between the two of you in your cases?
He tried to shift the blame. He basically, everything that he did, he tried to throw it back on me and say that it was me. But even though that didn't have an impact within my trial, because what he said didn't come out within my trial. But even just in terms of having a fair trial, it was agreed with because he got found guilty first. My defence made an agreement with the prosecution that they wasn't going to mention his conviction, because obviously I wasn't convicted at his trial, even though we're tried on a joint enterprise basis, because it would have made my trial unfair if one person had already been found guilty. then it would make, obviously, if it's a joint enterprise case, then it can only be one verdict. So the prosecution agreed that, and then soon as the opening statement was this, they mentioned that my co-defendant has already been found guilty for murder on a joint enterprise, which therefore I'm equally responsible as well. And the judge allowed that evidence in.
So you're convicted of murder, despite the fact you say you didn't inflict any of the injuries to the victim who died. You're convicted of murder. What was your sentence?
So I got life with a minimum tariff of 15 years, and my co-defendant got 17 years.
So
So
2 more years.
did it 2 years more for actually committing it.
So at no point did he accept responsibility.
No. I'm not
So
sure
you
whether he
could,
has now further down the line, but at no point throughout the trial did he accept any responsibility.
and what responsibility did you accept at the time and now, Noel?
Yeah. I think the responsibility I accept is that I drove there, even though it was unknowingly, and I didn't know it was going to happen. And as a result of me even being there in the vicinity, whether that contributed to him going into the address, whether he would have done it on his own or not, maybe that might have had a contribution towards it. But there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about the poor lad who died. I think about him every single day, and he should have never ever lost his life, and especially for something so senseless as well, and something that I to this very day I still don't really understand why he chose to carry out that attack. That's something that he needs to really answer for, and it's something that he's never really answered to, not even to me.
So you were 21 at the time. How old was your co-defendant and the victim?
The victim was, I think, 22, and my co-defendant was 23 or 24.
So you're sentenced to life with a recommendation you spend a minimum of 15 years in prison. Is this the first time that you'd ever been arrested by the police and charged? And
Yeah, I had two minor convictions. I had one for a theft and one for a criminal damage when I was a teenager. But in terms of any kind of serious charge, my first charge, my first proper kind of crown court appearance, and my first time ever in prison.
joint enterprise is in itself a huge, as you say, controversy, controversial kind of issue where people who are not even at the scene, not even in the location, are being convicted. You hear of these stories of young groups of individuals where someone gets stabbed or some violence takes place, and because they're associated with that gang or something, they end up getting sent to prison. You're sent to prison to serve 15 years. You go to Wormwood Scrubs. I know it was a long time ago now, but can you reflect on what that experience was like for you for the first time? I know what Wormwood Scrubs is like because I spent time in there myself, so I know exactly what it's like. And this old Victorian nick in the centre of London. What was it like for you ending up in prison for the first time?
It was pretty daunting. I remember walking on A Wing for the very first time, and you got your dungeons down the end, and it was my first real experience of mental health as well. And I just looked around and I thought, is this a prison or is this a hospital? And just looking at people, like just serious kind of self-harm going on, people committing suicides, violence. The violence was actually probably worse from the staff than it was from the men themselves, sort of the attacks on the men from the staff, which really, for me, at that very initial stages, in terms of recognising authority and respecting prison staff, when you walk along the landing and you see a member of staff assaulting somebody, then how do you look up to that person as a member of authority, or how do you have any respect for them, because they're not authentic leaders when they're basically doing the same crimes to what they're locking people behind the doors for?
Yeah, and that is an issue and continues to be an issue, although I think, it's been brought to the attention of the public and the authorities over and over again. And I think people like yourself who've lived the experience, sharing insights like I do about prisons, people are more aware of the brutality, and to some extent there are that there are things being done or have been done. And I know, because I was one of the recipients of the brutality of the prison officers in Wormwood Scrubs, and we even won a legal case against the prison officers who used to brutalise us down in the segregation unit, and we were very successful in having that unit change. Just talk to me a little bit about the 15 years that you spent in prison then, or the length of time of that life sentence that you spent in prison. I mean, did you, one, attempt to have your conviction overturned or your sentence reduced? I mean, how did you manage those 15 years?
It was even to this very day, it's a struggle, because after my conviction, two jury members wrote letters to my trial judge and saying that they were bullied and intimidated into reaching my verdict. And they said, this man is not a murderer. We made the wrong conviction. And basically they said that 3 or 4 other jurors also felt the same way. If that's the case, that was near enough half of the jury. It wouldn't even have been a majority verdict, never mind the unanimous one. I didn't find out this information. So my trial judge received this information a couple of days after the verdict. I got sentenced 6 weeks later, and they've told my legal team about it at the time, but they forbidden my legal team to tell me about it. So my legal team now are coming to me discussing possible appeal points whilst holding this information from me. And then eventually then the Lord Chief Justice, he gave permission for my legal team to disclose it to me, but I can't see the letters, or I can't look at the letters, can't have any contact with them or anything like that. And so within a month of me finding out, it's gone straight to the appeal court. It's bypassed the single judge, gone straight to the full court. And I went to court that day, and they left me in the cells. They wouldn't even let me into the courtroom. But basically, what the judges said within the court, they said, well, whatever happens in the deliberation process stays in the deliberation process. We're not willing to investigate it, and basically for me to carry on. Didn't even look
So they
into it.
took no action despite the juries raising serious questions about the verdict that they made.
What they did say, but I had a really incompetent QC at the time. What they did say, there was no evidence of dissent from the jury when the verdict was being delivered, but there was. And had I been in the courtroom that day, I could have raised it. The evidence was that there was several jury members crying their eyes out when the verdict was being delivered. Because I found it pretty odd. I found when you don't find someone guilty for murder and sit there and cry your eyes out about it, and then obviously the letters then followed after that. But had my QC stood up and said, yes, there was evidence, the jury were crying, so that's enough evidence to suggest that they were unhappy with the verdict at the time, and then that was followed by the letters. I didn't find out any of this until I got back to prison, and I had follow-up conversation because my family were in the courtroom as well, so they heard everything that went on.
I mean, I understand the law where the jury deliberations are concerned, and it's one of those, again, controversial kind of issues about whether we should or shouldn't be allowed to investigate what goes on in the deliberations room. But given that the juries had written letters to the judge, and the judge knew this before he sentenced you, the fact that they tried to withhold this information from any kind of appeal process seems shocking, and the fact that even though they were aware of this information, they decided that nothing further should be done. I mean, how did that make you feel, and what could you do about that, if anything?
It's a difficult one because probation don't recognise joint enterprise. So when you're trying to explain your circumstances to probation, all they see is the conviction as murder. So for very first stages of my sentence, it was, oh, well, you're in denial. You're not admitting to the offence. I'm not admitting to the offence because I didn't commit the offence. The offence says it's a single stab wound. So we both didn't stab him. So it's one of us that did it. So, and it's always been suggested that he was the instigator. He was the one who committed the fatal blow. So what is it that you really want me to kind of admit to? But even from the jury side, like for myself and for my family, it's the prison service have always said, well, we have to go on what the verdict says. And I'm like, well, this is actually what the real verdict actually is. But they just don't want to listen. They don't want to hear it. They dismiss it.
So how did you cope in the years that you were in prison?
For the first couple of years, I found it really difficult. I struggled a lot. just trying to, a young man setting off on this long journey. And I got offered counselling, and I thought, okay, do you know what, I'm going to take this. Maybe it might just help me in terms of my situation, be able to deal with things. 3 years later, they come back to me and said, "Oh, we've got you on the waiting list for counselling now." And I thought, well, keep it. I don't want it at this point. But what the real kind of changing point for me was actually from a dream. I had a dream one night that I was doing a vigorous yoga sequence. Yoga, I didn't even have a clue what yoga was. It was a load of yoga schmoga. It's, as I said, I got brought up doing boxing, a completely different end of the scale, but somewhere embedded in my subconscious, just waiting for me to retrieve it, was a new way of life, a new calling for me that I really wanted just to have a look at. Why did I dream this? Because I've never even seen a yoga class. I'd never even seen a yoga sequence. So it's definitely to be dreaming about one. I found it quite intriguing. So I went down to the library and I started to research the mental benefits and the physical benefits. And I thought, actually, do you know what? This is a bit of me. I'm going to try it. And then after about 6 weeks, I attempted a practice of Ashtanga yoga, a primary series. So basically, it's a strong flowing sequence. And I say an attempt because that's what it looked like at the time. But I just remember having a connection to myself, my mind, body, and soul, something that I'd never experienced before, which set me on a path that really kind of shaped and balanced me and gave me a sense of calmness and ease throughout my whole entire sentence from then on.
What did you do prior to discovering this yoga practice and the dream that came to you that drove you to practice yoga? What had you used as a mechanism to cope in the years before?
I think just in terms of educating myself and probably just being mentally strong and stubborn as well, because when I come back from my verdict, I remember it clearly. I was in shock, and a couple of my friends come into the cell and they just basically said, "How are you?" And at that point, I was in complete shock, and I was like, "I'm okay, I'm okay." And then one of them mentioned my mum, and then as soon as he mentioned my mum, that was it. I just burst out in tears, and I must have probably cried probably about 10 buckets of tears. And because I remember my mum screaming in the courtroom when the verdict was delivered, and that really resonated with me at the time, and that really hit me. And that night I made myself a promise. I said, I'm never going to shed a tear for the system again. I'm going to beat this. And I made myself that promise that I'm going to educate myself to the best of my ability and do whatever I can. And I went through my whole entire prison sentence without shedding a tear. Don't get me wrong, I've shed my fair share after getting out, but I had to keep that mental promise to myself to just remain completely strong and keep myself positive throughout. And thankfully, that's exactly what I did.
After a few years, you took up yoga. Where did that lead to?
So I started with my own practice, and that developed into a daily practice, and I really kind of got myself
And
into
this is something you were doing in the prison cell that you were in?
in prison cell, yeah, just learning from books. Everything that I've learned has been from a book, and I got to a point after a few years. I found that I'm no longer doing a life sentence. I managed to somehow free my mind, even though I knew I was incarcerated. And yourself, the system does throw a lot at you. I was constantly poked and prodded pretty much every single day, and I would describe prison as mental torture. But I've managed to take away the mental aspect of it, and I think I got to a point where I could help others as well. I was doing a lot of mentoring roles around safer custody and violence reduction and listener roles, where I was really making a massive impact on people's lives. And with that, then there was a couple of groups of guys in particular who were prolific self-harmers, and I thought, I'd like to just share some of my meditations with them just to see if it's going to have any benefits. So I started doing just simple one-to-one meditation classes with them. And after a couple of weeks, they were coming back to me and they were saying they haven't self-harmed, they haven't had any thoughts of self-harm. I'm like, wow, I was nowhere near a practitioner at this point, but I've managed to pass on something that I've learned myself, and it's working for other people as well, which really kind of opened me up to a new path that actually, this is a path that I want to follow. And I then got it in my mind that I want to be a yoga teacher.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because as I reflect on my time in prison, I mean, in the early first couple of years, I used yoga as a means of escape as well, and to keep my body physically capable. And then over the years, kind of practiced it kind of on and off, but kind of kept it not quite a secret, because there was times when a yoga teacher would come in and I'd attend a class like other people, but I didn't take it very seriously. I mean, I could carry out lots of the sort of positions and other people, but I wanted to ask you this, doing something like yoga, being mindful in prison, in that environment where most people don't take up these kind of avenues, it can be frowned upon by other prisoners, or at least the person who has taken it really serious, becoming very mindful and conscious of their own well-being. It can be frowned upon by other prisoners who might look at you as being a soft touch or something or another. I mean, how did you manage to navigate that kind of path?
Well, when I started doing the physical aspect of the practice with the men, I was running classes all over the prison, and initially you would have some people, oh yeah, nah, yoga, it's not for me, or it's for women, or it's, just that have their own perception of it. And then I'd be like, okay, come along and try it. And what I would do for the guys who were kind of, a bit loud or a bit reluctant or wouldn't take it serious, I would step it up a notch, because I was in really good physical shape myself. And so I would bring them through a serious workout where they wouldn't be able to talk, or they wouldn't be able to mess about, because they'd have to concentrate so much on their breathing and concentrate so much on their body movements. And then by the time it actually come around to the meditation and the relaxation aspect of it, they couldn't wait for that part, because they've put their body through their paces, and that was a well-deserved rest and relaxation for them. And I've did over 4,000 hours of teaching between staff and residents within prisons, and when I was a prisoner, and I only recall one negative, and it didn't turn out negative in the end. There was one guy who was being quite disruptive within the class, and I'm sitting there now and I'm thinking, okay, I've got to resolve this, and I've got to resolve this as a teacher, and I've got to resolve this with compassion. And where back in the day, then it probably would have been a different kind of story. So I just stood up and I threw love and kindness at him. I said, you know what you need, mate? And he's like, what's that? I said, you need a hug. And he just, what? But everyone else in the class, they're looking, what do you mean you need a hug? I said, that's what you need. I said, you need a hug. And he's like, what do you mean? So I put up my arms. I said, come here, give me a hug. And he's walked over, and he actually did it. He put his arms on me, he gave me a hug. But it completely disarmed him. He didn't know what to do with it. And the whole dynamics of the class completely changed. And he come up to me afterwards and he apologized. He said, look, I'm really sorry. He said, look, I'm just not going for a good time. And he said, thanks. He said, even just having a hug and just, you show me that kindness just really made a massive difference for me, which was quite a powerful moment for me as well, as, as a male, as a prisoner, and, to just call someone out where normally there'd be fisticuffs, and I was like, you need a hug, mate. It's probably something that no one else in that room, not even myself, has ever heard from anybody else.
How supportive were the prison authorities in what you do? I mean, I'm just trying to gauge, how they reacted to you, a prisoner, running classes with other prisoners. And you mentioned that staff were then partaking or participating in these classes.
Initially, there was a lot of blockers. There was a lot of staff wanting to block me doing it. They were saying, oh, well, you're not a qualified teacher, you're a prisoner, and basically you can't do this. So sneakily at the time, then I contacted various different yoga schools, and I was determined that this is what I want to do. And it was actually the more of them telling me that I couldn't do it, I wanted to do it even more. So I contacted a school and I explained where I was within my own personal practice and my teaching. And I did a level 4 yoga teacher qualification with them. So it was like 10 written exams, and somebody had to come in and assess me, doing a practical assessment as well. And I flew through the whole lot of it. I turned probably a 2-3 year course into a 6-month course, where it was my hobby. It was something that I studied all the time anyway, so I didn't find it too difficult to be able to fly through. And when I went back to staff, I said, right, I'm qualified now. Has anyone got any issues with me teaching? they didn't really know how to take me because they didn't even know that I was doing the qualification in the first place. But there was one particular governor, and the deputy governor at the time, he's probably the best governor that I've ever come across within the prison service, and he was really on board in terms of promoting growth within people and just giving people chances and opportunities. And he allowed me not only to start my classes back up, but he turned my job into a paid position. So I was now a paid yoga teacher within the prison, going around all the different departments, delivering multiple classes pretty much every day of the week. So it was a good work experience for me because I was a senior teacher before I even got out of prison.
When did you get out of prison? How long did you actually serve?
So I served 15 years and 2 months in the end. So I was 2 months over tariff, which, as you know, people doing life sentences is not bad because, you know, it could have been a lot worse. I could have gone years and years over. And when I found myself within, just as I was coming to before my DCAT, I wanted to kind of look at my future and what I wanted to do. And I knew that I wanted to be a yoga teacher, but I wanted to make something different with it as well. I wanted to bring something around my lived experience and my experience of working with people with complex needs. And I wanted to take the guys on a journey, not just coming to one class, because I've seen the benefits that one class had done for people, and I wanted to make that more beneficial for them. And so I come up with the idea of writing my own 10-week mindfulness-based yoga program. And I was in my cell, the small little cell on the wing at the time, and I started drawing out a mind map because I just needed to get these ideas out of my head. This was on an A4 piece of paper, and then that wasn't big enough, so I had to stick another piece, then another piece, and another piece, and then I had like about 30 pages of this mind map just stuck together, and it was like hanging off the bed on the floor, and I just keep having to turn it around and moving it around. But after a couple of weeks of writing it, I thought, you know, this is it. This is the program. This is what I'm going to do. My vision was that one day I'm going to bring this back and I'm going to change lives with it, and that's exactly what I'm doing with it now. And I work jointly with an organisation. I started managing a company, Penal Reform Solutions, when I was in prison, when I was in a DCAT. And that's an organisation that goes into prisons up and down the country, creating growth projects and doing a lot of different types of training with staff and the residents. So with that company, I continue to manage the company today, but I've just recently now set up my own business, Noel Yoga Wellness and Training, where I bring a completely different style of training to organisations and to prisons. So it's not just the yoga course itself. It's if I'm training stuff around, say if it's trauma informed or whether it's motivation interviewing or whatever it may be, I bring a whole holistic type approach to that training. So it's not just about giving you the skills of what you need to speak to people. It's actually giving you the skills of actually what you need to deal with your own stuff and your own baggage and your own traumas and stuff that's going on to make you the best practitioner or to make you the best person that you can possibly be.
And is it just for people in prison, or is it for organisations and corporations or groups of people on the outside as well?
The course itself that I've designed, that's specifically designed for people within prisons. But the training and the work that I do, it's in multiple different fields. It's up and down different sectors. So it's criminal justice sector, charity sector, kind of corporate well-being, whatever that may be. Like, I believe that everyone deserves, you know, a sense of well-being and to experience a sense of joy and peace. And if I'm able to facilitate that and give that to them, then I don't really care what sector that really kind of falls in, as long as it really aligns with my values and I can help them grow, then count me in.
So this is more than just going into a classroom full of individuals who want to bend their bodies in particular ways and then spend a bit of time meditating in order to calm their thinking and their behaviours and their physical being. Give me an example of the benefits that an individual will get from the program that you use in these environments.
So with it's 10 different sections, so 10 different modules within the course itself, and a lot of it covers a lot around mental health. A lot of it will cover stuff around self-harm, it'll cover stuff around breaking habits, stuff around sleep and depression. So it's not just, yeah, here's some yoga moves or here's some mindfulness techniques. It's actually getting them to understand their own mental health. It's getting them to understand areas of self-harm, areas of depression, the acceptance, how they can break habits and all that kind of stuff. So the first course that I taught, I remember the delegates pretty well on there, and there was one guy in particular, he suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome. He couldn't get out of bed till 2 or 3 o'clock in the day, and like I went and spoke to staff and I said, I'd really like to get him on the course, and said, like, he won't even get out of bed, he won't engage, he won't get on it. I said, let me speak to him and let me see if I can get him on the course. And when I spoke to him, I managed to persuade him to come along, and a couple of weeks into the program, he come up to me and he said, Noel, he said, thanks. He said, I've got my life back. I said, what do you mean? He said, I've been on medication for 8 years. He said, I've come off my medication. I'm getting up at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to the gym. I'm working. Like, I know that I can't put it down to the course to have that, to work that quick within that short period of time. But somewhere it's triggered something psychologically with him to give him the motivation that he needs. In terms of sleep is improved by 100% by all participants within the program. Self-harm, there was no thoughts or there was no self-harm at all throughout the program itself. There was one guy who he suffered from schizophrenia. He used to constantly hear voices. He found within the yoga classes, the voices slowed down, and within the relaxations and meditations, sometimes the voices stopped completely, which for him, that was something new, something since he started experiencing that form of mental health, he hadn't experienced that before. People with ADHD, they've never been able to sit still. One guy said, this is the first time in my life that I can ever remember that I've been able to sit still without moving. So, it's got a massive, powerful range from all sorts. And that just really drives me, and it makes me want to do it even more. I've delivered 4 courses this year already, so it's 4 back-to-back 10-week programs, which is a marathon, and it's taken its toll. But when I sit there in a session, and when you've got a group of hardened men talking within these sessions, and they're talking about their trauma, and they're talking about their mental health, and the mask just comes off, and and you see that real care inside, and you see the human side to them, and how much they want to support each other and develop each other. And for me, it's like, when you get the proud dad moment, like, I've got these hardened men and they're called, no, look at this, is this right, is that right? And I'm just sitting back and I'm thinking, you know what, I created this program when I was in your situation, and like, it does feel quite emotional when I do it. And like, I had one of my colleagues with me, and like, I was just saying it to her, I was just like, just how powerful it is, and she can see it herself as well, just how powerful it is to see that you've passed this on to somebody who you was in their exact situation when you wrote the program yourself.
And do you think that's what, it sounds like that's one of the biggest drivers when you were in that environment, especially in the early days where you were having mental health issues yourself because of the sentence that you've just got at such a young age, and you were looking down the lens of 15 years in prison, and you found something to help you cope throughout those years. A couple of questions really. Were you in that position where you were self-harming, where you were going down the route where there was nobody helping you get away or escape the things you were inflicting on yourself, and you found something to help you cope and you wanted to share that? Or was it just, you saw this as an extension of what you could do to help people?
I think I've never gone down the route of self-harming myself. Probably I just couldn't do that to myself or my family in that instance, but that doesn't mean that I didn't go through the same, feeling the same and the same frustrations, because back in the day there was no one to tell me it was going to be okay. There was no one to give me hope. There was no one to show me light at the end of the tunnel. And if I'm able to do that with people, because as you having that lived experience and gone through it yourself, we instantly connect to people within the system. And I remember after 6 weeks after being out of prison, I went into Bristol prison for the first time, and I wanted to just speak to some of the men there. I wasn't delivering anything. I just wanted to share some of my journey with them, and just to try inspire and give them some hope. And there was a couple of young lads there that were 21, 22. They just got found guilty for murder. They were looking at 25 and 30 years the following week. And I just had a 10-minute conversation with them, and one of them come up to me after the conversation. He said one word. I said, "What's that?" He put out his hand, give me a touch. He says, "Hope." He says, "That's what you've given me." And I just walked out of that prison with the biggest smile on my face, even though it was sad to see, the environment and stuff like that. But to know that a 10-minute conversation with someone that's getting a 25, 30-year sentence and you can give them hope, then what else can we do? If we're really engaging with people, if we're really helping people grow and develop and we're training them, then you can do wonders with that.
It's incredible, Noel, and I wish you all the best with the projects and programs. And I hope, we've talked about my foundation and your supporting and collaborating with my foundation with the work that you're doing. How did you cope after 15 years getting out back into society where things have changed so much? How did you find the reintegration back into society and the support network around you, etc.?
Thankfully, I've got a good support network of family and friends, but it hasn't been easy. It probably this last few months it's got easier, but I've only been out of prison a year and a half, so it hasn't been very long itself. But it's finding that sense of belonging where you belong in the world. Everything has changed. Everything is different, and the person you once was and the people you once knew don't exist anymore. Everybody's changed. Everyone's got old. Everybody's getting on with their lives, and it's just really kind of finding your niche and where you kind of adapt. And what I have found, probably the most triggering thing really, is probation. I've gone through a lot of stages with probation that, because they want to bring up old wounds, they want to bring up old stuff, and I've had to say it to them a few times myself. I said, look, I want to keep this strength based. I want to keep this about growth. I want to keep, I want to move forward. I want to kind of put whatever's happened in the past behind, and just to help me develop. Because even in terms of my work and the things that I do, there's been many barriers put in the way that not wanting me to even carry out my line of work. But I've really had to fight and challenge to get to where I have to be in terms of that in itself.
That must be really difficult, and I think this whole stigma of being a prisoner, being in prison for murder, serving 15 years in prison, trying to come out into the world and then sort of finding your feet, employment, running your own business. Tricky going back into prisons because they probably see you as a high risk individual. But I think people also don't realise that as a former lifer, you're on life licence and can be dragged back into prison at any point or at any time if you did something or they perceived you to be doing something that is not conducive to your licence conditions, etc. So I didn't realise that you'd only been out 18 months. I didn't realise that you were still adapting, 15 years, 18 months. Wow, I didn't realise that. So congratulations on the fact that you have found a purpose since you've been out of prison, although it started when you were in prison. But I do have to ask the question, I suppose lots of people will wonder as well, why after spending, because I get asked this question all this time, why after 15 years in prison would you dare want to do anything that takes you willingly back into prison? I get it that you're trying to help other people or to show that there is another way using your experience. Like you just said with those young 21-year-olds who are now looking down the tunnel of 30 years in prison and giving them hope is admirable from your point of view, regardless of the circumstances. We're not talking about their crimes. We're not talking about their victims. We're just talking about what and how you get through this situation. So why would you want to go back after all those years yourself in prison?
Probably because I'm crazy. That's something that I've put a lot of thought into, like even before getting out, because I knew what line of work I was going to get involved in, and I think it boils down to that fact that I look at myself as that young 21-year-old and know that what I didn't have and what support I didn't get, and what things that could have made a difference. And I'm in that situation now that we've gone through such an experience and turned such a negative experience into a positive one, that I'm in a really unique position to be able to help so many people. And even whether it's staff or whether it's residents or because just educating staff in terms of actually seeing, when I've delivered nearly 100 training sessions to staff alone this year, and having that, just being able to share stuff through my lived experience, that this is what it's like from my lens. So if you treat people in this way, or if people, if you respond to situations in this way, then actually in the long run it's going to reduce harm for yourself and your colleagues, because the more harm that you're causing to the residents within prisons, the more harm it's going to cause you and your colleagues in the long run, because you're basically boiling a kettle, and one day that kettle is going to it's going to blow. So the more that we can build more positive, effective relationships within that, then the more likelihood that we're going to create safer environments within prisons. And then eventually it's about reducing harm on the outside. So by the time these guys get out, whether they're living next door to us or whether they're, wherever they're living, that it doesn't matter, because people talk about rehabilitation, and I don't believe rehabilitation really exists within prisons, because you have to be rehabilitated before you're rehabilitated. So it's actually where you rehabilitating people back to. And I want to find out, what people's needs are, what they actually need, how can I help them, how can I support them, because that's something that's probably never been asked for me in 15 years. It's more around, you need to do this or you need to do that, and I'm actually, no, I don't need to do that, because that's a box tick and that's a box tick. Ask me what I really need and what can help support me as a person, and that's where you're going to get the best out of me.
It's so interesting, that you say that, because the impression that many organisations who work on reforming prison or rehabilitation programs and the services and whatnot that they offer, you hear a lot and read a lot, especially you and I and people that work in the criminal justice space. They're familiar with the various different organisations who get funding from the government or they're charities that do lots of things. So it's incredible to hear you say, after 15 years in prison and being released quite recently, that none of the impacts, or it doesn't have an impact. You were never asked what you need in order to help you. And it frustrates me to think that the impression or the perception that the public have that much is being done, or the people that work in these organisations believe that they're doing so much, yet here you are, somebody who went through 15 years in prison, come out the other end and say, well, there is no rehabilitation in prison. That is a sad state of affairs. And I know that you're not criticising the system or these organisations or the work that they're doing. What do you see the big problem is? I mean, you're trying to fill a particular void with the work and the programmes and the projects that you're going to push back in there to try and help others, but you have a motive because there was a void when you went into prison, and you've seen that void over the 15 years, and you can fill a particular void in the life of these people that need some support to humanise them and the staff for the reasons that you just explained, that they come out and they blow up, and if we can do something while they're in prison. What is the problem here, Noel? I'm trying to identify, and it's great to have someone like yourself share this with us, because you have that lived experience, and I hate that term, but it's there.
Yeah.
What do people need to know?
I think the prison, like you do get a lot of charity sectors, you do get a lot of organisations that do come in and that do make a difference within people's lives. But when you look at the system as a whole, and to talk about rehabilitation, talk about these offending behaviour programs, they're more focused on the punitive aspect of it. They're more focused on, actually, do you know what, this person's kicking off, so let's put them on losses, or let's take this away from them, or let's take that away from them. Actually, what they need to know is why this person is doing this in the first place, why this person is acting in the way that they are. Because normally if somebody is acting in a particular way, it's probably because they're acting out to something in a particular way, or they want something, or they need something. And it's even like with self-harm within prisons, like a lot of staff have the perception that people who self-harm are doing it to manipulate, they're doing it to get something, they're doing it to whatever it may be, and they call them the manipulators. And my argument to that is, okay, if that's how you feel, if I need to argue my point, if I need something, I'm going to argue my point assertively, I'm going to challenge it assertively, I'm going to go down a legal route or do whatever I need to do. I'm not going to cut myself to shreds because I need my canteen or I need something. So clearly there's a behaviour there, there's some form of mental health there that needs to be addressed, because it's not normal behaviour for some, whether they're doing it to achieve something or not. It's not normal behavior for someone to do. So really just asking people, how can we help you? How can we support you? And giving them meaningful activity, meaningful work. So because I did this meaningful work that I do, that set me on a career path where I now have my own company. A lot of the prison jobs that they offer within prisons are within workshops, which I call slave shops. So you're just there and you're putting bolts together, and they're soul destroying. Because what that tells a person is, okay, this is all I'm worth. By the time I get out, to replicate a job like that on the outside, you're not getting no skills. It's going to set you up on a minimum wage job. And with people who have gone to prison, if they're used to living a life of crime, they're used to earning a lot more money than kind of people would do within a normal job. So you need to give them a good incentive to say, okay, do you know what, actually, I can get meaning from this work. This work is going to bring me joy. This work's going to help people. This work's going to help me build a family life. It's going to help me build a career. I don't have to look over my shoulder. But if they're not offering them kind of things within prisons, then I don't think, that prisons are going to work, because clearly they're not working, because look at the reoffending rates and look at the overcrowding that we have within prisons at the moment.
And I think it's that vicious circle of conversation, isn't it, where we know that we know what you're talking about is true, i.e. the meaningless jobs in prison, are setting prisoners up for coming out and being frustrated because they don't want to do that. I mean, a job is a job, and some people will do and will need those jobs just to pay their way, and we can't knock that. But I mean, it's this vicious cycle of conversation where what you're saying I've heard and people have heard so many times, and then there are the voices that sort of say, well, they deserve nothing more, especially in this country. It's not the kind of message that I hear from the global audience that respond to the program I make on Netflix and the insight I give on prisons around the globe, including work that I've done in British prisons. But there is that voice that can be louder at times than your voice, my voice, and campaigning reformers, where they're sort of saying, well, they committed the crime, they deserve to be punished in prison. Where does that lead to, Noel?
But then you have to look at is why people are committing crimes in the first place. So when you're looking at people's mental health and you're looking at people's adverse childhood experiences, you're looking at people's trauma, and there's circumstances pretty much behind nearly pretty much every offence. And it's like, I've often asked prison staff, I've turned it around in them. So if someone attacked your family or your kids, what would you do? And their initial response would be, I would kill them, or I would do this, or I would do that. I said, okay, but that's your initial response. I said, so a lot of these people within here, their initial response is pretty much the same thing that probably any parent initial response would be out there. So it's just understanding, like, I'm not justifying any offence or anything like that, but it's understanding the person behind the offence. It's understanding the circumstances around it, because on paper, I'm a convicted murderer, but I'm not. I never put hands on anybody. I never had any intentions to cause any harm. So the good thing that I take from my offence is that my conscience is clear. I know that I can go sleep at night, and I know that I haven't got that over my head, that I haven't killed anybody or I haven't harmed anybody in that way. So, but the people that have done it, dig that little bit deeper and understand the circumstances around it. And what I do find a lot within prisons as well is people's communication skills. Not all of them, but a lot of them are not great. So I might be trying to say something to you, and you might be writing it down and perceiving that in a completely different way. And by the time that's already written down, so it's put in your risk assessments or your WASIS reports, by the time the next probation officer comes along, they've copy and pasted that from that one, then it's copy and pasted again, then it's copy and pasted again. And before you know it, you've got a whole risk assessment of someone, quite a large document of probably 10% of it is actually facts, and the rest of it is some people not actually listening to what somebody is saying, and they're not understanding where they're coming from, and they're just making their own judgments and their own assessments, which again, we'll come away from this conversation here today, we'll both have different perspectives. Not that any of us are right or any of us are wrong, it's just we all have different views of the world, and every person has a different view of the world. So just really having that clarification with people and just understanding, is this what you meant? Is this what you're telling me? And this is what I'm writing down before I put this on the report. Is this exact information? And just, that way you're going to build relationships, you're going to build trust with people as well, because when people read that and they're like, well, that's not what I said, that doesn't, that's completely different, then it puts an impact on that relationship.
It's really interesting. I mean, 18 months you've been out of prison after 15 years of being in prison. No doubt near the end of that 15 years, you were going to the lower category prisons, which probably meant that you were entitled, whether you got it or not, to some home leave where you get out for short periods of time or you work in the environment. But I'd be interested, and I'm sure others would be interested, Noel, in the humane side of your existence. In other words, you mentioned building trust and relationships with people. How's that been for you since you've been out of prison? Because no doubt these things are challenging for you, because it's difficult to build relationships with people who are not already in your life on the outside. So how has, technology, relationship building, trust building, and just existing on the outside after so many years in prison? Because some people think it can be so alien that it's impossible to do. Some people sort of say, well, actually, you can live a life in prison, which means your transition back into society is not as challenging. I often use an example of, there's no handle on the inside of a prison door. So, learning the behavior of opening the door again is one of those conditions that can be quite challenging. Sleeping in a single bed, and now you have the option of sleeping in a big double bed, or sleeping beside someone if you've not slept beside someone for so long. And as a lifer, you often spend most of your time in single cells, or at least I did. I don't know if it was the same for you. So just that transition back into society, I know we spoke about it a little bit earlier on, but the building of relationships and trust, etc. How are you managing that?
Well, let's just say tech wise, I'm still adapting to tech side of stuff, especially like online training and stuff like that as well. I don't think I can deliver anything online without having a technical difficulty of some sort. But that's something I'm just going to have to learn and adapt as I go along.
Well, for what it's worth, most people can't, even though they've been using technology since its existence.
Well, I think it's difficult in terms of relationships. Like with my family, I love my family to bits and they love me, but just having that void, being away from them for so long, it does have an impact, because you're not as close, and you're not, they've got on with their lives and they've been living their lives for 15 years, and all of a sudden I'm back into that life, and it's just like, where do I fit in as a son? Where do I fit in as a brother? Where do I fit in as an uncle? Kind of within all of that. And then I think, just even in terms of kind of intimate relationships and stuff like that as well, probably initially it was, you don't really want to kind of tie yourself down. You don't want to build a relationship because you haven't been in one for so long either. So it's just really getting used of spending so much time with somebody, because as you said, we've been in a single room for so many years on your own that you're not used of having other people around you. And with authority, like with probation, I believe there's a lot of good people within probation, but I think the system as a whole is a failing system, and you've got a lot of people more so at the top that they kind of bark these orders down to the probation officers, and they have to carry out the work. They have to put risk assessments on people, or they have to make decisions that are not the correct decisions at all for that person in particular. And I appreciate there's different risk involved with different people, but I think if you're going to build a relationship with somebody, that person needs to be the decider in terms of what they can do with your life, not somebody above them or somebody above them who has never met you or doesn't have any understanding of you. And when I go back to that copy and paste culture, where they're just reading historical documents that's been just copy and paste throughout so many years, no one's really getting an accurate fact of what's going on. And I suppose what I find in the system as well is you go through the system of, you know that they don't trust you. You know that everything that you say to them, they have to check out because they believe you're lying, or it's not the truth. So they have to check out every single word you're saying. And I suppose I find that with myself as well. Everything they say to me, I don't necessarily believe it either, because trust works both ways. You can't trust a person if they don't trust you.
It's so interesting. Last question from me, Noel. You've given up so much of your time, and it's been really interesting listening to you and the experiences and the character that you've built within yourself. What does the future hold? I know it's very short since you've been released, and you have plans and you've plotted some plan, but what do you hope the future over the next 2 to 3 years will look like for you?
I think probably it's probably a good thing or a bad thing, depends how you look at it. But I'm extremely ambitious in terms of wanting to achieve my goals. And when I set off writing my mindfulness yoga program, my intention was that I want to bring it national. I want to bring it everywhere, and that's on my mind. That's something that I will achieve, and I'm already in the process of doing that. But I think probably just not being so hard on myself. When I often sometimes sit there and think that, oh well, I should have done this, or I should do this, or I should do that. But actually, when I reflect upon it, I've been out 1.5 years. I'm in a good job. I've got my own business. I've got my own place. I got a nice car. I am doing well. I've got good support around me, and so actually, on reflection, I'm changing lives pretty much every day of the week. Like I wasn't well last week, and I was lying on my sofa, and I got a message off someone on Instagram. It was a family member of somebody who I'd been delivering training with in prison, and it just really kind of just bounced back to me why I do what I do. And like he said, look, just want to reach out to you. I've been following you for a while. And he says that you've been training my cousin within such a prison, and he said that you've really had a massive difference on his life, and that you've showed him that that you can achieve anything, no matter what your circumstances are, and you've really helped to motivate him and give him positive change. And I'm lying on my sofa feeling sorry for myself, and I'm reading this now, and it just really kind of just bring me up. And I thought, yes, just reinforced, this is why I do what I do. When you can lie back and a family member that you don't know can contact you, and that you're still having an impact on people's lives, even by not doing nothing.
And that's really good to hear. But I also saw that you gave a TEDx talk quite recently. I mean, that's quite an achievement. 18 months out of prison, and you're already speaking to a wider audience about who you are and what you do. That must have been very inspirational for you and for those that were listening to your talk.
Yeah, it was. It was pretty daunting, because I do quite a lot of public speaking, and I don't really find much of it quite daunting at all. But I think just being on that red dot, doing your TEDx, it was pretty daunting kind of build up. So I had to use my mindfulness techniques before I went on stage. But I just wanted to do it just to really kind of show people that it doesn't matter what environment that we're in, it doesn't matter what we're going through in our lives. If you believe in something, and if you want to achieve something within your life, then you can always pick up your torch, you can always get on your horse, and you can gallop your way to the end of that tunnel. That was
That's
my message.
brilliant. And that's such an important message to end on. Noel, thank you so much for sharing your story in such detail and talking about stuff maybe you've never spoken about before. And I'm sure those listening to this will take away exactly what it is that you're delivering. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you, or prison authorities listening to this, or any organisation listening to this wants to get in touch for you to maybe bring your program to their space, how can they do that?
Good way, probably best way to contact me would be on LinkedIn. So if you just look me up on LinkedIn, I'm quite easy to find.
And it's Noel Moran on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And will they find you under the Penal Reform Solutions or your own?
So they'll see me, Noel Moran, Director of Nola Yoga Wellness and Training.
That's the way to contact you. Noel, thank you very much.
No problem.
Enjoy the rest of your day doing very many other virtual calls. But thank you for coming on the podcast.
No problem. You too. Cheers.
Thank you for watching or listening to the Second Chance podcast, where we share stories of redemption, hope, resilience, and second chances. Who deserves a second chance? Who has the right to give someone a second chance? And is a second chance even deserved? That's what Second Chance is all about. So subscribe if you want to be kept up to date with new episodes.